Today I'm going to show you my process of underpainting. I get a lot of questions about how I paint certain things. What paints do I use? How do I achieve a certain effect? The truth is, I'm really just using a few simple tricks over and over again to get a variety of different results. And the main trick I use every time I paint is underpainting. A big component of this is also Zenithal highlighting, which you might be familiar with or you might have heard people talk about. So today I'm going to be covering all of those things. Underpainting, sometimes called sketch style, is when you paint an entire miniature in black and white first before you add any color to the figure. People often ask me, what are the benefits of putting in all of this effort up front instead of just using, say, a layering technique, or a base coat and then shades and then a highlight? I would argue that the most important part of any miniature painting is your highlights and shadows, and making them look natural and not forced. Mastering this technique is kind of like learning how to build a really strong, rigid foundation for the building you're going to build. Once you've built that strong foundation, and you know the house isn't going to fall down, then you can decide on what it's going to look like on the outside, or what sort of interior design you're going to put into it. The colors on a miniature are kind of like that. They don't really matter as much as you think they do. They do matter a lot, and I'll be making more videos about that. But I feel like the most important thing for any painting is how dark the shadows are and how light the lights are. And I think when a lot of people look at my paintings and they say, wow, this has really bright colors, how do you achieve this? It's underpainting every time. Because I'm putting down these really bright whites and these really dark blacks underneath those colors that are really going to help them pop. So if you want to achieve really nice neons or really bright kind of fluorescent colors, this is the way to do it. So there's a lot that you can do with underpainting. But for this first video, I'm going to narrow it down to just 5 steps. And those steps are prime black, Zenithal highlight, dry brush white, Nuln oil, and final highlight. And it's that simple. In order to follow along, you're going to need an airbrush setup and basic airbrush knowledge. I'm not going to cover how to use an airbrush in detail in this video. I'll be covering that in a later video. And if I eventually make that video, I'll be linking it right up here. I might not, but if I do, I might as well put that link in there. If you don't have an airbrush, you could use just pans of spray paint to achieve a similar effect. It's just not going to look as good as if you use an airbrush. You will also need the following paints and supplies: Vallejo Airbrush Thinner, Vallejo Glaze Medium, Vallejo Black Surface Primer, Vallejo Model Color French Mirage Blue, Vallejo Model Color Pale Sand, Games Workshop Nuln Oil, as well as your miniature of choice. You're also going to need some sort of palette, nitrile gloves, paper towels, a water glass, a brush with a good tip, a brush with a very bad tip that you don't mind ruining, a cheap makeup brush for the dry brushing, although you could use any wide brush, as well as any other basic supplies you use for airbrushing, which I'm, again, not going to cover here because this video would get too long and complicated. First things first, before we do any sort of spraying, we're going to want to put on a respirator. If you're airbrushing without a respirator, it's just really bad for you. Don't do it. All right. Respirator on, gloves on, spray booth on, compressor on. Now we can get started. My primer of choice is Vallejo Black Surface Primer. It works pretty well and it dries pretty quickly, meaning you can move on to your next step even quicker. For our test model today, you can see I'm using an older model from my collection. It looks like it was primed a long time ago, but it has a lot of nicks and dents on it. So we're going to give it a nice fresh coat of black primer before we proceed. For this model, you can see I'm using approximately a 1-to-1 ratio of Vallejo Black Primer and Vallejo Airbrush Thinner. Make sure you put the thinner in the airbrush first, and then the primer to prevent clogging. Take note that I'm not using Vallejo Gloss Black Primer, which is easy to confuse, and I've definitely picked it up before by accident. Although it probably wouldn't matter, you could probably use Gloss Primer if you want. After that, mix in the paint with your worst brush that you don't care about. Then to thoroughly mix it, I'm going to put my finger over the tip of the airbrush and run a little bit of air through it to the point where it's going to have bubbles come up through the cup. If you don't see bubbles, your airbrush is probably clogged and you need to clean it. Once our paint is mixed in our airbrush, we're ready to prime. Apply your paint in a series of thin, even coats until the model is completely covered in black primer. Always use the thinnest coats possible when airbrushing, especially at this stage, to maintain the crispiest level of detail possible. One of the things I didn't think of when planning this demonstration was that I used an older model which had some primer on it already. This primer was, I think, a little bit too thick, so later on in the process you'll notice that we've lost a little bit of detail. I'll show you later when it's compared to another model that had not been primed 10 years ago. As a rule of thumb, you should never see paint pooling on your miniature in a wet way when airbrushing. You want to pull back and use quicker, thinner coats, and you'll be on the right track. Once you're done priming, it's time to dump the excess paint. And if you're clever, you can dump a lot of the paint back into the bottle you were using. Then we're going to clean out our airbrush using our method of choice, and then we can move on to step 2. Zenithal highlighting is probably the most important part of underpainting. If you take nothing else away from this video, I would encourage you to consider doing some Zenithal highlighting before painting any of your miniatures. So what is a Zenithal highlight? What is this sort of magical painting technique you've been hearing all about? A Zenithal highlight is when you spray black, gray, and white, or similar colors, in succession onto a miniature in a way that simulates natural lighting, or if you prefer, what the sun looks like when it's at its highest point in the sky, or zenith. Perhaps the best way to see this effect is to look up pictures of marble statues, which have very crisp details, and because often they are made of white-ish marble, you're going to be able to see really starkly the shadows and highlights. You can see here in this picture of Michelangelo's David the effect that I'm talking about. And if this isn't Michelangelo's David, don't get mad at me. The highest points are almost entirely white, and the lowest or most recessed points are darker to the point where the deepest recesses are entirely black, or a very dark color. I'm not actually looking at the picture right now, but I think it's pretty dark, right? And then all of the other colors are somewhere in between. By spraying down on your miniature with successively lighter colors, you're going to simulate the effect of natural lighting on your miniature. For more on this, I would suggest you look up life drawing and tonals, which is where I first learned about this. So for today, we're going to do this in 2 steps. First, we are going to spray a wide arc on the miniature of Vallejo French Mirage Blue, which is really a gray, but I guess it's actually just a very desaturated blue. Followed by a much tighter arc of Vallejo Pale Sand. So using the same steps that we used to prepare our airbrush for priming black, we're going to load up our airbrush with a 50-50 thinned mix of airbrush thinner and French Mirage Blue. Once our airbrush is loaded up, we're going to spray in roughly a 60-degree cone around the miniature. You don't want to go any further than about, actually, is that 60 degrees? I don't know, it's about that much. You don't want to go any further on any side than this. You want to kind of stay in this axis so that you're just simulating the light shining down from above. which to the human eye is going to be sort of like what you expect to see. You can do all kinds of other lighting with Zenithal highlighting as well, which I'm not going to cover here because this is a video on the basics. But for now, we're going to assume our light source is directly above the miniature. When you're satisfied with how it looks, you can clean out your airbrush and fill it up with a 50-50 mix of Vallejo airbrush thinner and Vallejo pale sand. You can see in this example, I'm just putting the paint straight into the cup because I have a pre-mixed bottle of 50-50 airbrush thinner and Vallejo pale sand. I use this color so much that I have a pre-thinned bottle of it, which saves me a lot of time. The reason I usually use pale sand instead of a more traditional white paint is that I find most white paints tend to be rather chalky and tend to clog my airbrush. So I've found pale sand actually makes a very nice warm white. If you're painting a miniature that's more on the cooler spectrum, you could also use Vallejo Wolf Gray for this step, which is sort of a very light gray. Wait, is it? Yeah, it is. So for this step, you're going to do pretty much the exact same thing you just did with the gray paint, but you're going to do it in a much tighter arc. I like to start with the airbrush directly above the miniature and give it a few coats just like this. And then you can go a little bit off to the side, but try not to go much further than like this. You can use your own discretion. After you do this a bunch of times, you'll kind of get a feel for how far you can go. But generally, you're trying to get a very bright highlight just on top, so you don't want to go too far over to the side or anything like that. So many of these techniques are about practice, so take your time and do what looks best to you. After you've painted 100 of these, you'll start to get a gist for exactly how to do it and what looks natural. When you're done, clean out your airbrush and you should have something that looks kind of like this, although I assume probably a different miniature. From here, you already have an amazing base coat and you could just go ahead and start painting your miniature. However, there are a few steps that I would recommend taking before you start painting. The quickest way to help your figure's lighting pop just that little bit extra is a dry brush highlight. Some of you may be concerned that this will make the figure look chalky or give it that dry brush look that I'm sure you're all familiar with. However, you're going to be putting other paint over this anyway, so the dry brush texture is not going to show through. Maybe you've done some dry brushing before, and maybe you haven't. In either case, I would recommend that, if possible, you buy one of these. This is a makeup brush that came in a set of like 10 of these for $6. These brushes are extremely soft and are ideal for dry brushing. For this step, I'm using Vallejo Pale Sand again, only this time I'm using my unthinned bottle. I'm just going to take a tiny bit of this paint onto my makeup brush and then wipe off the majority of it on a paper towel. At this point, you're going to want to run your makeup brush from the top to the bottom of the miniature, and this will make it so that any of these crisp little details will get highlighted with pale sand. Use as many light coats as you like until you find a result that looks good to you. Again, from here, you could go ahead and put paint on your miniature and it would look good at this point. You don't really need to do any further steps. But I'm going to suggest Step 4, Nuln Oil. If you've never heard of Nuln Oil, it is a thin paint made by Games Workshop, which collects in the recesses of your miniature and gives you some free shading. It's actually a crime not to use this in your underpainting because it's free shading. Of course, you could use any sort of ink or wash for this process. If you're in a hurry and you're painting 100 goblins at once, you could just take this and put it all over your miniature. That would be fine. But what I'm going to suggest is that you are a bit more strategic and just put it into the deepest recesses of your miniature. For this step, I'm going to use my good brush, also known as the Windsor & Newton Professional Watercolor, what's it called? Watercolor Sable #1 brush. But you can use whatever brush in your collection that has a nice tip. The way I like to use Nolan Oil is I dip the brush into the pot until about half the brush is saturated in the paint. Then when pulling it out, I use the rim of the pot to get rid of any excess paint. You don't want too much paint on your brush for this process. Otherwise, it's going to flood the miniature in ways that you might not want it to. For this step, we are just going to apply the Nuln Oil to the most recessed parts of the miniature. Thanks to the Zenithal highlight, we already have a nice map of where the shadows should be on the miniature. Some of the places you might consider putting it are creases and crevices, eye sockets, rivets, and any sorts of parts of the miniature where one surface is intersecting with another one. This step is going to give you your darkest shadows so that when you paint over this with a colored glaze, that deep shadow is still going to show through and you're not going to need to add it on top of your color. If you make any mistakes at this stage, don't worry, we're going to clean all of that up at the next stage, which is the Zenithal highlights, the dry brushing, and the Nuln Oil have already given us a lot to work from. However, keep in mind you're going to be applying colored paints over top of this, presumably. So really, at this stage, we want to exaggerate any highlighting and shadows so that when you put a colored paint on top of it, those shadows and highlights are still going to show through. So what I like to do to finish up my underpainting is to use a 50-50 mix of pale sand and Vallejo Glaze medium, just to keep your paint a little bit thinned and easy to work with. We're going to put some paint onto our brush, but then wipe off a lot of it with the paper towel. This will ensure that the paint does not pool onto your figure. However, you still want more paint on your brush than you did at, say, the dry brushing stage. Then we're going to punch up as many of these surfaces as we can that are going to be receiving the most light. Using your Zenithal as a guide, you can already see where the majority of the highlights should be. So you're just going to go through and emphasize those. You'll want to pay special attention to the highest points on the figure, such as the top of the head, the shoulders, the bridge of the nose if your character has a nose, places like that. You can also use just the side of your brush to highlight things like rivets, creases, or any other small details that could benefit from a little bit more highlighting. Remember, don't be afraid to go too far at this stage. You're going to be putting a colored paint on top of this after, so it's okay if you go a bit too far. At this phase, you might realize that you want some of the shadows to be a bit darker. Once you can see the contrast between the highest highlight, you might decide that you want your darkest shadow to be a bit darker. So at this phase, I usually go back and forth between the Nuln Oil and the pale sand until I get an effect that looks good to my eye. If you do this process enough, you're going to develop an eye for what kind of looks right. But until that point, I would recommend referencing pictures, again, of marble statues, just like Michelangelo's David. I'm not actually joking. This is actually a very good reference for how to start developing an eye for what looks right in a tonal. When I first did life drawing class, we started out by drawing actual statues because it was easier to see the shadows on a statue than it is to see on, say, a human figure. And that is the brief overview of pretty much how I do my underpainting. This entire process took me about 2 to 3 hours, but I was also filming it. If I wasn't filming it, I probably would have finished this entire process in an hour and a half. Also, keep in mind this process works especially well if you're doing multiple figures at a time. Most of the time when I am underpainting a unit of, say, 10 figures, it might take me 4 to 5 hours. So half an hour per figure, which might seem like a lot, but keep in mind that once you are done this process, you can just put a color glaze on your figure and it's going to be a lot more done than you would usually be at 30 minutes into your figure. Also, as a quick aside, I find that this process works best on miniatures with crisper details. One of the mistakes I made when making this video was using an older figure that was made of, I think it was pewter. But if you look at one of my more recent figures that I underpainted, these are Warcry figures by Games Workshop, you can see how the crisp details of a plastic figure can really be accentuated by the underpainting process. So where would you take the miniature from here? Usually, I will apply a colored glaze on top of the underpainting, followed by a few hand-painted details. You can see here an example of something we might do with this miniature. This is just a few colored glazes followed by a few hand-painted details. In total, adding color to this miniature took me less than an hour. I'll be covering colored glazes in a future video. Once I'm done that video, I'll probably put the link right here. If there were any details that were unclear, or if you have any more questions about underpainting, feel free to leave a comment down below, and let me know what kinds of other techniques you want to see me cover on this channel. In addition, you can follow me at Dana_Howell on Twitter or Instagram for all of my daily painting updates. Thank you for watching my video, and I hope you got something useful